in the last section, we got our raised button widget to show up on the screen, but it's sandwiched directly against the password input. In addition, the button itself is gray, which is just a little bit boring. So in this section, we're going to very quickly fix the color. We'll then take the break and we'll put in a little bit of spacing between the password element and the button itself. The reason we're going to take a break first is that the process of adding in that spacing is going to be just a little bit involved, and so I want to make sure that we have a lot of time to address it. So very quickly, let's make sure that we change the color of the button. To do so, I'm going to first very quickly open up my raised button class documentation. And then on my constructor, you'll notice that it has a name parameter of color. So we can simply pass in a color property to this thing and it will change the color of the button. So back at my raised button element inside the submit button method, I'm going to add on a color, and I can specify one of the constant colors on the colors class. So I'll say colors dot, and then I'll just make this thing blue, like so. If you're using VS Code, you can actually hover over that blue property right there, and you'll get a nice little preview of what colors.blue looks like, which is a nice little thing. All right, so quick test. I'll save this file. I'll do my refresh, and our button is blue. Okay, simple enough. So let's take a quick pause right here. Again, we're going to separate this into two sections because adding in the spacing is just a little bit complicated. So quick break, come back to the next section, and add that spacing in. We just updated the color of our button widget at the bottom to be a nice blue. We're now going to address the fact that we have absolutely no spacing between our password field and the actual submit button. Now to actually add in the spacing here is going to involve just very few lines of code, but it's a kind of a question of where we add this code that makes the spacing here a little bit more of a complicated thing than it might seem at first glance. So let me first say that to add in spacing anywhere inside of our application, we can very easily use that container widget, as we did up here inside of our build method. We saw this in the last application we worked on as well. We could add in a container that has a margin, and then we specify the sides on which we want to apply this margin to through the edge insets class. So adding in spacing, not a problem. Again, it's the issue of where we add the spacing. So let me show you one possible way of doing this, and then I'll tell you exactly why it might not be the best approach of adding in some spacing. So we want to make sure that the password has a little bit of margin directly underneath it to offset the button that we see. So I'm going to go and find the password field element. So here's the password field method. We've got the text form field inside of it. I'm going to create a new container widget, and I'm going to wrap the text form field with that container. So to do this refactor, I'm going to first put the container together right above, and then I'll cut and paste the text form field into it. That's the easiest way of kind of writing this stuff out. So I'm going to return a container that has some margin. I'll give it an edge insets, and I only want to have some margin on the very bottom of this field. So I'm going to add in only with a bottom named property, and I'll give it like 25 pixels or so of spacing. Then I'll add on the child property, and that's where we're going to add in our text form field. So I'm going to select just the text form field, so I'm not selecting the return keyword, and I am not selecting the semicolon at the end. I'm going to cut all that, and I'll paste it in for the child right here. So there's the child. I'll add in a comma at the closing parenthesis for the text form field. I'll remove the return statement at the bottom, and then I'll save that. Okay, so what we have right here, it definitely works. And let me prove it to you. I'll very quickly go and do the refresh. And we'll see that margin kind of applied to the bottom of the password field, and hey, we're looking pretty good. So let me tell you now why that approach is maybe not the best. If I go up to my column widget right here, we're currently placing the email field, then the password, then the submit button. So let's imagine for a second that we were not making a form to log in. Maybe instead we were making a form for like anything else, where we might want to reorder these fields in different ways for, I don't know, any given reason. So if for some reason I wanted to put my password field above the email field, let's do that right now. So I'll put the spacing in there. Now the password field shows up first, then the email field. So think about what's going to happen now. If I go and refresh at my terminal, we're now going to see a ton of spacing underneath the password, and then the email field is directly up against the button. And so we are in the exact same situation that we were before. So if we wanted to be able to quickly manipulate the order of the fields that are showed inside of our form, we would have to be doing a pretty big refactor every time. Every time I would have to go down to my password field, I would have to extract this container, and then instead add it to the email field directly. If I instead added the container to the button down here, then I'm kind of in the same order again, or I have the same problem as before. Usually, yeah, we're going to put our button at the very bottom of any list of a form elements. But let's say that for some crazy reason, I wanted to show the form or the button here first. And now we have the same problem if we had applied the container to that button. So the key thing here to understand is that if we take any one of these methods and we wrap them with that container, it's going to make it a real pain in the rear to refactor in the future. So there is a better way of adding in the spacing and making sure that we write much more maintainable and reusable code that doesn't have to be quite so intensely refactored every single time that we want to change the order of our fields. So let me show you how we're going to do that. First thing I'm going to do is restore the order of my fields here. So I'll put the submit button at the bottom, and I'll put the email field first. I'm then going to go back to my password field method, and I'm going to remove that container that we just created. So here's my container. I'm going to delete everything up to the text form field. I'll take off the extra parenthesis in there, and then if I save it, I'm back to how I was before. And so now if I refresh, I should still see my working application in here, but with no spacing. Okay, so we're back to how we were before. So let me show you the better approach that we could take. I'm going to go up to my column widget right here. Now inside the column widget, we're listing out all of our children. And as we've said, clearly adding in any margin directly to any one of these widgets is not a good approach. So instead, I'm going to add in an extra entry in this widget list right here. And in this extra record, I'm going to directly create a container that has some margin assigned to it. So I'll do an edge insets only on top 25 pixels. And I'm not going to add a child. So we now have a container element that solely applies some margin to our layout and does absolutely nothing else. This doesn't try to show any child inside of it. It just tries to manipulate the spacing inside of our layout. So now I think you can very easily see the benefit in this approach. I could very easily reorder my fields inside of here into any order that I want, and it really doesn't matter what order I end up with. I could put the email field at the bottom, the password field above that, and the submit button above that, and I've got this separate container element here that I could easily move around or cut and paste as I please to add margin anywhere that I want. So I could do something like that right there, and now I've got 25 pixels between everything that is displayed inside this column. All right, so let's very quickly restore to the order that we probably want. So I want my email field first and submit at the bottom. All right, so I'll save this and we'll do a quick test. And now we have the email, password, that 25 pixels of spacing, thanks to the container without a child, and then our button. All right, so like I said, this is a way more maintainable way of kind of adding in spacing between our elements. Much preferable to add in these kind of simple containers rather than always trying to wrap some element with a container and applying margin to that. Now, last thing I want to mention here, using a container in this fashion, well, as you might guess, only really works when we're using a layout widget like a column. So if rather than a column, we were trying to display something like directly in the form, which accepts a single child, well, in that case, then of course we have to use a container and provide it a child of whatever widget we want to show inside of it. So this methodology that you see right here is really only applicable when we're trying to show a distinct list of widgets on the screen. But nonetheless, in that case, very handy approach. Okay, so long last, we got our spacing in there. Let's take a break and we'll continue in the next section.